just wait till everybody has joined. I'll give it another minute and then we can get started. Good. My screen is being shared now. We'll wait another 30 seconds and then we'll get started. Can people hear me okay?
Yes, Doctor.
Yeah, you can. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so just for introductions, I'm Ollie. I was at Oxford until this year. Just started as a doctor in a town a little further south of Oxford called Aylesbury. And I did a PhD during my medical training, so I've got a bit of experience of academic writing. And hopefully today I can share with you some information of how to, focus on your academic writing and improve it. So let's get going then. What's the basic structure, as you were all sort of very aware of when you wrote your abstracts? And I will just say now, I'm going to provide you, anyone that sent an abstract, I'll provide you with your individual feedback just straight after this. I just wanted to give sort of group feedback first, and we'll work through it, and then I'll give you your individual ones. I didn't want to give everyone the answers before this session, so you will get that back, don't worry. So basic structure, as you all know, we go for the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And I'm going to drill into each of those individually. Please stop me at any point if you've got any questions. And then on the right here, you can see I put stuff that's relevant to writing an actual full paper, an academic paper. That will be in black later on, and then in gray will be what's relevant to abstract writing. Now, I chose an abstract to give you to write first, just because I thought it was a nice, easy 200-word thing for you to write. I didn't want people having to write pages and pages, and it's obviously a lot easier to give feedback on a small section like that. So we'll start off with the introduction. So I think that this was generally done pretty well. I'll give feedback on how you all did sort of as a group towards the end of this little introduction. So essentially, there's 4 steps to it, as you can see on the screen there. So you want to talk firstly about your field that you're in. So, this paper that I gave you was about potassium homeostasis, but let's say you're writing it about a disease, like you've done research in a disease, say hypertension, high blood pressure. What you want to do is, what do we know? What's the situation with that disease or this part of physiology? So, you might say how many people are affected by that disease every year, and what's currently known about why it's caused. So you want to highlight the state of the field, because then your paper it'll be easy to see where your paper fits into it. And that's where you come on to talking about what's not known. So you're saying, well, what's the gap in our knowledge, our scientific knowledge, that this paper is attempting to fill? And from there, you move on to say what your research question is and what your hypothesis of that would be. So what question are you asking? What do you want to find out? And what do you think will be the answer to whatever study you're doing? What do you think will happen? And so if you use those 3 steps, so in an actual paper, these will all take, a good couple of paragraphs, and you'll have all your citations in there. So the what is known bit might take a little while, because you want to know what previous studies have been, what the sort of textbook knowledge is, and then what's not known, you're focused on the latest things, saying, we're still unsure about this bit, and then that's when you come on to say, right, and this is the question we asked, and this is how we go. In an abstract, as you've all been doing, it's all very brief, so it'd probably be like 1 sentence for each of those, but they all need to be included. Okay, and then we move on to the methods. So this is sometimes the easiest part to do, because you essentially just list all the techniques that you use to try and answer the question. So in an actual paper, what you would have is methods as your section, and then you'd have like a subtitle for each method that you used, and you'd go through in a lot of detail exactly how you performed it. So, you know, what materials you used. Let's say you were talking about something like the blood sampling in this paper, then you'd go on to talk about exactly how you took the blood from them, what you did with that blood afterwards, and then what sort of assay or technique you used to measure the concentrations of things like potassium or aldosterone in them. So you do that in a lot of detail, and the key point is so that other people can see what your technique, you've used, and then they can see how well you've done that to the sort of standard of the field. And also it means that if someone wanted to try and replicate your work, then they could do that just by reading the methods. Now, for certain techniques, you know, if they're pretty well established, then, you know, you don't have to go into too much detail. You can just name the process that you used, and most people will understand that. If you're ever writing a thesis for something you're submitting for an academic qualification, then you need to go into a lot more detail, you know, the theory behind a lot of these different techniques to show your understanding. But for a paper, you don't need to do that because it would make the paper too long. And then for the abstract, yeah, you're even more brief. You're just saying, well, we use this technique, and you're literally just going to name it there. So, you know, if you've used flow cytometry, I don't know if people have come across that, you'd say we use flow cytometry to detect these types of cells, or we sampled the blood of these human volunteers and used an ELISA or something to measure the concentrations of these mediators or these components of blood. And so here it's more about naming them, and you're just sort of telling the story of why you chose to use those. But from your sort of introduction, it should be quite clear why. Again, feel free to ask any questions at any point, or you can put them in the chat as well, and hopefully I'll see them come up. So yeah, methods is probably the easiest bit, I would say. And then, so this is the key bit. So what are the results? And again, you see in the black, I've split what you do in a paper, and then the gray, what you'd sort of do just in that shorter abstract. So in the results, a bit like in the methods, you'd have split subheadings for each key result that you have. And then within that, you sort of present all of your data to show exactly how it supports that conclusion. So each one of those will probably have one graph or one figure that shows what, and you'd write as the subtitle what the conclusion is. And then you'd write underneath that, you'd say, you know, these are the results we obtained from this, and therefore it points towards this sort of conclusion. And you want to present in the text, you want to present all of the key data points. I mean, they'll be obvious in the figures in your, so by the figure, I mean like sort of the graphs and the pictures and things. That will be where all your data is shown, and then you'll comment on the key bits in the text. Now, I said about telling a story because you want to make it easy for your readers to follow it. So you need to, you know, an experiment will evolve, or a paper, a study will evolve. You'll start off by looking at one thing, and then you'll follow that up with another line of investigation, and then you follow that up, and then you follow that up. You start at point A, you get to point B, and then you carry on to C, D, E, and so on until the kind of study is complete. And so you want to start by telling what you looked at first, and then that meant that you wanted to go on and look at the next bit, and the next bit, and next bit, and so on. So each of those headings should follow logically like that, and think about the way in which you order those. Then you want to, in the abstract, you essentially, you haven't got time to, or space to put all of the results you've got. You just want the key one that shows whatever your headline title is. You want to know, you want to make sure there's enough in the abstract that tells you, you know, we've got evidence for this. Now, sometimes you'll put in actual numerical results. Sometimes you won't, depending on, you know, if there's a key set of numerical results that really show that you've got evidence for what you're trying to show. Other times, you know, you might just say like there was a significant difference and so on. I think it's good to put a couple of numbers in there so people know like the size of the main effect, but it sometimes won't be necessary depending on what sort of study. Now, it's not always possible, and I would recommend it when you're first writing abstracts. I would recommend to use the structure, as a lot of you did, where you literally write on the left side introduction, and then you write everything there, and then methods, and then results, and then discussion, because that really helps your reader understand, which bits are which bits. Okay. Now, you can sometimes have more of a free-flowing abstract where you don't separate it into sections, although they should be generally there. And sometimes this is useful because if you've used a lot of different techniques and they all relate to different results, sometimes you might want to mix them all together in that methods and results section. So you might want to say, we use this technique to look at this, and we found this result. And then that made us look at this other thing. So we use this other technique to then find out that next bit. And you can see you might sort of go method results, method results, method results. That's okay. That's an acceptable way to write it. I think it just makes it easier when you're starting out to go method and then results if you can. But so for a paper like the one I gave you, I think that was perfectly fine to do that because it was quite a short paper. One that is a little bit longer, has a lot of different types of results, you might need to sort of to combine them. So talk about one method and then what you found from that, another method and what you found from that. And then finally, discussion, which is the most variable part, I would say. What you're trying to do is, as I said in the introduction, you're saying what's not known about whatever topic we're doing the study on. And here you're emphasizing why or how your study and your key finding fits into that field and the context of it. So you want to start by talking about your conclusion, which would be, so, all your results point towards this finding, okay, the key finding. And then you'd say, how that relates to other findings in the field and how you can add this little bit of knowledge to what's already known about it. A lot of journals will then, and you then discuss a lot of other literature. You might say why your result fits with other studies or why it conflicts with them, and then add your evidence to everything else and come up with conclusions from that. Because you can't conclude everything based on one study. You will always need to apply other knowledge that we already have from other studies in order to get the actual answer. Some journals quite like you to put a limitations section in there, which I think is quite important because a lot of academic publication is about selling your study and sort of in a very one-sided way saying why your study is very good and why it shows a thing you're trying to say it does. But obviously this can lead to, this is bias because you're always going to try and promote your study. So if you can have a little section on limitations, just say, our study, was good for these reasons, but it obviously has these limitations. For example, in this one that we've looked at, you might say it was only tested on, sort of, I think 20 human participants in one of them, like in the main study of it. They were all, I think, from the same sort of place at one center. So, you can't necessarily apply this to everyone, every human or every patient, things like that. And there might be limitations on the techniques that you have that you can only record, things to a certain level of detail. The way you make your measurements might not be as exact as you would ideally like, but it's just the limitations of the technology. And then future perspectives, just think about sort of where the research could be going, what still needs to be understood, what would the next study be? If you could add a piece of data to your study, what would it be? And then this should have been in gray here, but in the abstract, you're just saying, what's the relevance of your key result? And then just saying how that highlights, how that fits in with the rest of the field. So you can see the abstract is just a very condensed version of the whole paper. But you don't need to start putting in things like limitations. You can mention maybe future studies if they get like what you'd like to do next, maybe in the abstract, but you don't have to. So the abstract, it should be able to give someone a good idea of what your study is trying to show. Now they'll need to read the full paper in order to properly analyze it to see what the strengths and limitations were and read about exactly what techniques you did. But I mean, a lot of people, you don't have time to read everything. So a lot of what they read will just be the abstract. And so you've got to make sure you've got enough detail in there to make them want to open up the full paper or to get them interested in it. because I tell you, otherwise people won't read your papers if the abstracts, don't give them a reason to. So this is feedback on all the abstracts that you sent to me. And I thought it'd be good just to give some overall feedback of things that were generally done pretty well or mistakes that were generally made that you can all sort of apply to your own learning. And then, as I said, I will email you all individually the feedback I had for each of you. But these were just some recurring themes that I thought were worth noting. So, first in the introduction, there was sometimes, and I'd say these were all very well done, and I was very impressed with how well you'd understood the studies and how well you'd written the abstracts. One of the key things I really liked was how concise they all were. I think you all kept to sort of the 200-word limit. You got a lot of detail in not that many words, which is ideal. If your abstract's too long, nobody's going to read it. So in the introduction, I say some people sort of highlighted what the study had already shown in the introduction. I wouldn't tend to do that. I would sort of leave that to the results and the discussions. I would just say what we're trying to look at or what question we're trying to answer. You don't have to sort of say, oh, and we found this. I find it's a bit better to show how it evolves. So say we looked at this, these were the methods we used, and then this is what we found. So don't put that in the introduction generally. I think some journals quite like it. I think it's generally better to save that. So you want to say what your hypotheses were and what is not known. I think some of you, because this paper was looking at sort of a gut sensor that led to potassium excretion as part of homeostasis. And I think some of you sort of seem to suggest that, oh, we know that there's a gut sensor and we know that this mechanism exists. Well, actually, this study in context, we weren't very sure of that. And this was like a big piece of evidence towards that. So you want to emphasize that that's actually unknown if you're writing an abstract about this paper. Then the methods I thought were very well covered, probably one of the best. There are a lot of you that actually, I found this quite good, was you abbreviated things. So if you, in this paper, if you'll remember, you had the 3 different conditions. So you had the meal plus potassium pill by itself, or the meal depleted of potassium. And I think you'd all abbreviated those, like meal plus KCl, meal, and then meal minus KCl, or something like that. And I thought that was good because it made it very easy to read. And you've got 3 conditions. I'd even be tempted to number them to make that very clear. So I think abbreviations can work very well if you're going to be saying the same thing a few times in your abstract. Then the other comment that I had was, some of you have put in some units for this many milligrams, or you measured the concentration in these units. Don't worry too much about that in the abstract. You can leave it for the actual methods in the paper. I would say, it's sometimes good to put the like a general idea of, like, say your key result, you might want to quantify that, the potassium went up this many times in one group versus another, things like that, just to give an overview of what sort of size of effects you're using. Sometimes, when they gave the eplerenone, as you saw, to block aldosterone, sometimes you might want to put the dose. Other times, you might leave it. If it was a clinical trial where you were giving a drug to try and sort of cure a disease or sort of reduce the effects of disease, there you might want to put the dose, because that's quite relevant to knowing what people would do, if we were putting this into practice later. But for a study like this, where you're just trying to block aldosterone and see what happens, I wouldn't worry too much in the abstract about putting exactly how much of that drug you gave. So the results were pretty much explained well. I think you all got the idea that if we look at the graph here from the paper, this is probably the key figure, but you all got the idea that there's evidence that if you have the meal plus the KCl, which is the middle one, you don't increase potassium, but you do increase the urinary excretion. And this is independent of aldosterone, because if you block it with a eplerenone, it still happens. That's like a very good set of results to use. What I wanted people also to mention was what's in this figure. that if you give the KCl by itself, you do get that increase. And if you give the meal without the KCl, so depleted of it, you get the decrease, and then it comes back up. And what you can conclude from this is it's not a gut that's sensing potassium, because when you just give the potassium, it increases. But if you give the meal without potassium, it decreases, suggesting that there's something sensing food rather than like potassium or anything itself. So it seems like whenever you eat, that stretches the stomach or something in that way, in some way that's sensed, and then that leads to this caloresis. So yeah, if you could incorporate the results from this graph into your results part of the abstract and talk about how the differences between those three groups were important, I think that would be another good thing to add. And then you could say, and the caloretic effect was not blocked by eplerenone, so therefore it was not due to aldosterone action. So I think that's the secondary bit. This is the primary result. Hope that makes sense. And then discussion, yeah, like pretty good. Sometimes it was quite short, but I think if anything, discussion is possibly the least important part, because it's the bit that's most prone to sort of your own bias when you're writing that paper. So yeah, just one or two sentences. You want to summarize what the key result is, what you're claiming to show. So that'll pretty much be the title. And then just say, you know, how that fits into our understanding of potassium homeostasis. So yeah, generally pretty good. Sometimes you don't need to put like one sentence. I just like one or two sentences just to make sure that you cover all of this. So I'll email you all the individual feedback. We've mentioned this result here. Now, if there aren't any questions at this stage, any questions? Silence, there's no questions just yet, and I can't see anything in the chat either. So let's have a look at what the actual abstract was for this paper. And if this is something, you know, this is a skill that you might want to practice, is writing abstracts. And that's a good way to practice your academic writing. So what you can do is get other papers, don't look at the abstract, read the paper, and then see if you can summarize it in an abstract in like 200 words again, and then compare it to the actual abstract. So I've highlighted in here, based on those same colors from back at the beginning, introduction in red, then methods in orange, results in green, discussion in blue. So here is pretty much where the actual abstract from this paper and the actual title for it's at the top. That's how it's pretty much divided. Like I said, I quite like it if you go introduction is this, methods is this, results is this, and discussion's that. Because if you separate it out, it just makes it a lot easier to read. So let's have a look through them, and I'm going to get some of you to try and answer how well you think they've written the abstract, because, you know, no abstract is going to be perfect. So you've had a go at it. I've given you all some feedback on the general things that I thought, you know, could be improved, but what was done well. So let's make this interactive, and let's get you to tell me what you think's good or bad about each one. So the introduction part of their abstract is here. What do we think about that? And you can all see that, I think, can't you? Yep, go ahead, Mason.
Well, I think it's very well written, because we can see a zoom out, a general idea of what we're talking about, and then a zoom in on what exactly this studies wants to study. But I think the like when I read the numbers, I got a little bit lost. They lost me there. So if I were writing it, I would try to write it without the numbers.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think that's a good idea, actually. In the introduction there, yeah, like I've said when I was talking about methods, you don't always need the numbers. So you can probably get rid of this sodium and potassium, the numbers on that. I agree, actually, because it doesn't really tell you anything from just the abstract. You need to read the paper. But yeah, you're right in saying the first sentence tells you what the background is, and then they said they studied it. And yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay, is it Orjwan?
Yeah, that's correct. I think
Great.
they missed the gaps in knowledge. They did not mention that.
Yeah, so they've been a bit brief with it, haven't they? They've said this signaling axis has been proposed to regulate potassium excretion. But yeah, okay, I agree. They could say, we know that potassium is regulated through some of these mechanisms, including aldosterone and extracellular potassium concentration. It's suggested that the kaliretic signaling axis from the gut exists, but we don't know this. Yeah, they could have made that more explicit. Anyone else?
Yeah, I believe they did not include a lot of literature in the introduction. I mean, they put part of the method at the end. They explain some of the method used.
Yeah, so they didn't put a lot of the literature in, but that's generally okay, unless you were looking if there was like one key paper that you were looking to write a response to, you might mention that in the abstract. But generally, you don't need to do any citations or anything. You just need to say what we do know, and then you'll put those citations in your actual introduction. So yeah, I think it's okay just to say, it's been proposed that this thing exists, but we don't know it exists. Something in the chat. Yeah, and so you've mentioned there, hey, you've mentioned why didn't they mention the hypothesis or the aim? Yeah, that's a very good question. They've just said here we studied this. So if you were going to do this properly, you might say we hypothesized that it did exist and it was aldosterone independent, and so we aimed to test it, and then talk about how they went on to do that in the methods. Yeah, I think these are all really good points, actually. So yeah, you could probably improve on this part of the abstract. We'll just move on to the methods. So here's the methods. What do we think about that? So one thing I could start by saying was that at the beginning, they haven't mentioned how they measure these things. That could be good to talk about. They've given the doses of potassium. Yeah, you might include that, but it depends how much you know about sort of what the general potassium intake would be. And so therefore it might not mean very much to you to go, and it certainly doesn't to me to go, oh, it's 35 millimole. Well, what does that mean? Is that a lot? They could have maybe said, oh, the normal daily amount or something, or the normal amount in one meal or something like that. Someone in the chat. Yeah, yeah, it shows the method very clearly. I think that is the key strength. They're saying we've got these three conditions they're testing. So they're looking at the oral potassium load, the deficient meal, or the deficient meal plus the potassium. So that's pretty good. I would even be tempted just to go, there were three conditions, and then go 1, 2, 3 to make them very clear to stand out. Yeah, so they've explained why they chose that method. Fine. And then, so that's the main bit. And then as you all picked up on the second bit of it, so they're showing that some sort of gut sensor exists. And then they're looking at, well, does it involve aldosterone? So then they've added that in the end. So yeah, I think it's probably a better bit than their introduction. There's less criticism to make of this. I think that's quite a clear summary of their methods. Next, so the results. So quite short. Anyone got anything to say about this one? I mean, even if you're just going to say it's good, that's fine. I'm happy to start off as well. So I think the first bit is like a useful sentence to have in there. So in response to the potassium deficient meal plus the 35 millimole potassium. So again, a lot of you had abbreviated that to the meal plus KCl, which is really clear, because then if you've done that in the method, I can go, oh, condition 1 is, or whatever it's, sorry, condition 3 is meal plus KCl. And if you go here, meal plus KCl, I can see the link nice and clearly. So yeah, I think you did that probably a little bit better. And they've talked about how the potassium excretion increased, but the serum potassium didn't increase. What I would like them to talk about is, like I said, the difference between these three. So show that it suggests there's something stretching the gut that causes this effect, by explaining the differences. So the one they're talking about is the one in the middle. But say if they just gave KCl, then it does increase, and if they gave the meal by itself, it decreases, suggesting that there's something in the gut that senses a meal and then relays this to the kidneys. So I would like to add that bit, but then yeah, the last bit, it persisted after blockade from a perinone. That suggests yeah, that is good. Yeah, Salma says brief and in context excellent. Yep, I think that's pretty good. Hayam has messaged me, I think, directly. So the rest of the chat won't be able to see it, but I'll read what they've said. It's not clear enough. They didn't say anything about outcomes related to their work, like percentages, more precisely, maybe. Yeah, I mean, that's that could be worth saying. Just a couple of percentages. You know, if I go back to that graph, if you show how much it increased or decreased, yeah, that could be worth saying. I guess the key thing is that it did or didn't increase, yes or no. But yeah, like that's a fair point to say. A little bit of data in the results could be good. Yes, Salman said the same thing. Oh yes, so Omar's just said, doesn't that mean they're giving results in the abstract? Yeah, so in the abstract, you definitely should give the results. What I said before was you don't want to give it in the introduction bit. You want to actually say what it shows in the abstract, but you don't want to go like, you know, the background is this, and we showed this, and then talk about all your methods and everything. You want to leave that. I think it flows a bit more naturally to go, here's what we're looking at. So we wanted to ask this question. Here are our methods, and then this is a result we found, rather than doing that at the beginning. But yeah, no, you definitely do want to give some results in the abstract. Just check the chat. Yeah. So Mason, you said, yeah, it'd be good to say whether it's significant. Yeah, very good point. So you could, a way to do that is quite often to say, you know, let's say you have group 1 and group 2. Group 1, the potassium was significantly higher than group 2. And then you put in brackets what they were. So group 1 was this, group 2 was this, and then you might want to put the p-value. That can work as well. So say in words what the result showed, and then put in brackets, here are the actual like numbers. But again, you don't want to overload your abstract with numbers. You just want to do it for the key results. So yeah, I think talking about these 3 groups, and then talking about the blockade with the perinone, you could put some numbers in there. So Salma says, how results with this explanation will be different from conclusion? That's a very good question, actually. So the results are just saying, right, we did this specific experiment, and this was the result from it. So an easier example would be, let's say I'm measuring blood pressure in somebody. And, oh yeah, let's say I'm trying an antihypertensive drug, and I've got group A who are getting the drug and group B who are placebo. If I say after the study, the blood pressure in group A was significantly lower than group B, and then I put the data in there, that is the result. Now, the conclusion and the discussion bit would say, you know, we think this medication is lowering, well, we've shown that this blood pressure medication is lowering blood pressure better than placebo. and therefore it could be useful in treating the disease. You see that in the first bit, I'm giving a very unbiased I'm trying to, very unbiased sort of description of what exactly the result showed. Blood pressure was lower after this intervention than the placebo. That's an objective thing. In the discussion, you then say, well, what can we conclude from that? Well, we can conclude that that drug is effective. Saying the drug's effective is not necessarily an objective thing. That's a bit subjective, but giving the actual result of the experiment is objective. It's saying, look, we tested this, and this is the result. And then how do we interpret that? That's where the discussion comes in. So all your discussion or your conclusion is a result plus interpretation. So they've actually, and a lot of papers will do this, they try and add a bit of discussion into the results to try and sell their story a little bit better. So if you look at here, calories is persisted following aldosterone blockade with eplerenone, further suggesting independence from aldosterone. So this further suggesting independence from aldosterone, that's not really a result, that's an interpretation of the result. So that's more of a discussion. We happy to move on to the discussion part? And again, sometimes it's okay to integrate your discussion with your results. You know, if you have a couple of results, then you might want to say what each one shows before you sum it all up at the end. So here's the discussion. They say that the signaling axis exists and it's independent of changes in potassium and aldosterone. And then they talk about the implications. And I think that's something you all did very well in your all abstracts. You said at the end, they've talked about, you know, how significant is the existence of this thing. So we're shown it exists, but we don't know, like we haven't quantified exactly how important it is. And you talked about how you'd like to do that going forward. So I think that was good. So you can see here the result of the study, like the conclusion from the study is that this signaling axis exists, right? But the actual result was just this, right? So potassium increases when you just give the potassium, doesn't change when you give potassium plus meal, goes down when you add the meal because the system is being activated, but there's no potassium coming in to offset that increased urinary excretion of potassium. So that's the result. And then you're saying, based off of that, we can conclude that this does exist. So I hope that answers the question about what the difference between results and discussion is. Excellent. No, that's good to know. Thank you. That's clear. So what do we think about this one? Feel free to shout up. If not, I can say what I think about it. So I think they've got a clear, in that first sentence there, they've got a clear conclusion. That's what they're sort of showing. You could maybe say that it exists and then say, and it doesn't rely on aldosterone. But yeah, I mean, they've pretty much done that just in one sentence. And then, yeah, I think this is pretty good. We don't know how important it is yet, but it may account for a significant component. And that's kind of hinting at what your future studies would like to look at. So I think this is probably done pretty well. Yeah, that was the end of my slides actually. But is there anything else that people want to ask about or any comments they had? Or anything else about academic writing that you'd like to ask? Like I said, I did this on an abstract because I thought it'd be easier just to do something quite focused like that. But if you've got questions about writing papers and things, then feel free to ask. Also, I don't know if I've given you all my email address. I can't remember if it's on the emails and everything. But I'll put my email address in the chat. And if anyone wants to ask anything like that you don't want to ask right now, or or you haven't thought of it until later, then feel free to email me and I'll do my best to answer. Okay, so a good question from Mason. Can you base a literature review on abstracts instead of reading the full paper? It would be nice if you could, right? It would save you a lot of time. I would say you don't need to read every bit of the paper, but you want to make sure you've looked at the paper to see exactly what methods they've used, have a look at their data, see what you think it shows. Because when you're reading a paper, yeah, the abstract is what they want you to take from it. But if you can actually look at the data and the figures, you can draw your own conclusions. So every paper should be able to be condensed into, say there's like 5 figures in the paper. If you just looked at those figures, what could you conclude from it? Because it might not be exactly the same as what they're trying to conclude from it. They might say, oh, it definitely shows this. And you go, well, actually looking at the data, it might suggest that, but there's got these weaknesses. So the way that I try and do it, so sometimes if you're doing a review and you just want, some old literature that says that something to be true, it's well established, is true, then it's okay to use just the abstract. It's a paper, or say it's like a famous paper that is all very well accepted. You just need to cite that. That's completely fine. Just look at the abstract. But when it's a paper that you're looking at and it's a key part of like the discussion in your literature review, of one thing versus another, or you're trying to figure out exactly how something works by putting all these details together, something that's less well established, definitely fine to look at the abstract to work out if it's worth reading that paper, which, yeah, I always tend to do. But you then need to go into the actual body of the paper itself. And just, even if it's just to make sure that you're happy that it does say what it's telling you it says, that the result is as valid as they're saying it is, that's fine. You may look at it and you go, yeah, I'm happy with what they've concluded from that. So I've seen the data, so happy to write about that in my review. But you want to look at the actual paper because you can then come up with your own sort of criticisms and sort of limitations of these studies. They may say they've got a very significant effect, and it may be statistically significant, but it may be a very small percentage. And you might not get that from the abstract because they'll just say it's statistically significant. But in the paper, you'll look and you'll see it's only a very tiny difference. So is it clinically relevant or physiologically relevant? So yeah, unfortunately, for the key papers you're going to be discussing, you will need to read. So Salma says, if there's some time, can I have feedback on my abstracts? This will mean because it's my first. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm going to give. Oh, that's good, Mason. Yeah, you understand that. So yeah, I'm going to give you anyone that sent me their abstract. I think Salma, I wrote notes on all. Yeah, I've got your one here. Yeah, I'm gonna, after this session, I've written down all your feedback and I'll email it directly to you. I think you sent it to the Octopile email address, so I'll reply to those emails, and then you'll get your individualized feedback. But yeah, I think they were all very strong. I think I got about 8 of them. Yeah, I got about 7 or 8, and I think they were all very good generally. Not a problem at all. Advisors. Oh yeah, feedback. Yeah, so if you don't mind filling in the feedback form for us, you can do that sort of, once we've ended the call if you want to, or you can start doing it now. That would be very helpful. If there are no more questions, then we can probably leave it there and I'll get your feedback sent out to you. Like I said, my email address is there. So yeah, if you've got any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Thanks very much. We'll end it there. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Dr. Neely. Bye.